All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Cathy Tracey, and I am here with my friend and colleague, Adam Walker, to give you sort of the high points on the school reopening guidance that was issued last week by the CDC and the Department of Education. We're also going to provide an update on the status of the FFCRA tax credits, which have been unavailable to schools so far. And our promise to you, knowing how busy you all are, is that we're going to get this done in a half an hour or less. So in terms of today's topics, first, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about whether the CDC and Ed guidance even really matters at all. Specifically, is it legally binding on schools, either directly or indirectly, or is it just a resource? So we'll talk about that. Then we'll give you an overview of what that guidance actually says. And then finally, we're going to give you an update on the FFCRA tax credits. And because the word tax was used in that phrase, I'm going to leave it to Adam to talk about that. We'll start with the first question, which is this federal guidance actually binding? And the answer is, at least directly, no. Neither the CDC's operational strategy nor the Ed COVID-19 handbook directly obligates schools to comply with them. In fact, the CDC describes its guidance as an operational strategy that presents recommendations based on the best available evidence at the time of the release. So really, it's just supposed to be a guidebook on how to return kiddos to school. The Ed handbook goes even further to make it clear that it's not binding. If you look at that last sentence of this quote I included here, it says, "This volume does not have any force or effect of law and is not binding in any way, except where statutory or regulatory requirements are referenced." And I didn't include it in the slides because it was a half page long. But at the end of the Ed guidance, there's actually a comprehensive legal disclaimer that puts the Miller-Johnson legal disclaimer at the beginning of this slide to shame, basically making it clear that the Department of Education doesn't take any responsibility whatsoever for anything contained in the handbook, and none of it actually represents the position of the Department of Education. So obviously, you know, as I went through, the federal guidance doesn't bind Michigan schools on its own, but that leads us to the question of whether there are any Michigan laws or administrative orders that would make this guidance binding by incorporating that guidance into its own orders. So in Michigan, the two orders that we would need to worry about would be the MIOSHA order, which deals with workplace safety issues, and the MDHHS order. So first, let's talk about the MIOSHA order. In that order, it does require schools to comply with, to have a COVID-19 preparedness and response plan that is, quote, consistent with the current guidance from the CDC. Now, keep in mind, the school's COVID-19 preparedness and response plans are workplace safety plans. And the new guidance that we received largely deals with returning students to school. So there may be some overlap such that I think it would be a good idea to take a look at your preparedness plan and make sure that it's consistent with this new guidance. But it very well may be consistent already. But I still would recommend that you take a quick look at that. The other place where there's overlap in the MIOSHA order is that the procedures for disinfection have to be consistent with CDC guidance when there is a suspected case at school. That's already happening, so I don't think that there's going to be any change there. And then lastly, the MIOSHA order requires schools to follow current CDC and OSHA guidance for personal protection equipment. That really is referring largely to masks and face shields and things like that, which we'll talk about a little later. But But again, there's not going to be a huge significant change there. With respect to the MDHHS order, which deals with gatherings more generally, it's really silent in terms of references to the CDC guidance. So in that MDHHS order, the focus is really on requiring schools to work with and comply with local health authorities. The only place you see any reference to CDC guidance at all is if you look at the interim guidance for athletics that was issued on February 7th of 2021. And that just says very generally that CDC guidance should be adhered to for athletics. As Adam is going to explain later, the most significant distinction between the federal government's guidance and Michigan's guidance on athletics is that at times the federal government would be more restrictive of participation in contact and indoor sports at lower community transmission thresholds than Michigan would be. But again, that's only guidance that doesn't have force of law. So let's move on and talk a little bit about the guidance itself. The core principle of this guidance is that it's critical that we return kids to in-person instruction as soon as possible. And that with an integrated mitigation strategy, we should be able to do that. So the guidance sets forth different components that can be put together and considerations that we should work through in order to have a comprehensive strategy that will allow kids to attend school in person and safely. So this would include consistent implementation of layered mitigation strategies that would reduce transmission in school. And we'll get to what those look like next. It also includes monitoring community transmission, which I know that we are already doing in Michigan schools. And then third, it's implementing a phased mitigation strategies and changing the modes of learning. By modes of learning, I mean, are we in person, are we hybrid, based on the level of community transmission. The guidance also talks about additional strategies to help reduce risk and exposure at school that deal with screening and testing of students, staff, and teachers. So, and that includes both referrals for diagnostic testing when a student or staff member either has symptoms of COVID or has been in close contact with somebody who has a COVID positive diagnosis, and screening people who are asymptomatic as well. The additional strategies also include promoting vaccination, which I know that all the Michigan schools are currently doing. The guidance also talks about some equity considerations that schools should engage with their communities over. The idea or the concern is that COVID has had a disproportionate burden of illness and serious outcomes for certain racial and ethnic groups. And so returning to in-person education may pose a greater risk to those communities than in others. And that has to also be weighed against the fact that lack of in-person education may particularly disadvantage kids in low resource communities. So the idea is, the guidance is that schools really need to partner with their community and their parents and their community resources to figure out what is the best strategy for returning schools to in-person education safely. So let's talk about the mitigation strategies for a minute. There are 5 essential elements that the guidance includes: universal and correct use of masks, physical distancing, hand washing, and respiratory etiquette, cleaning and maintaining healthy facilities, contact tracing, quarantine, and isolation in collaboration with the health department. And the guidance states that the first two of those strategies are the most important and deserve the most emphasis. I kind of laughed when I saw universal and correct use of masks, because I thought, wow, those CDC folks have never actually been in a high school, because obviously correct use of masks is a constant battle for everybody there. But really what they mean is that the school should just continue doing what they already have been doing, which is modeling and enforcing proper use of masks whenever masks can be safely worn. I also wondered if there would be any change in the recommendations with respect to masks, now that we're seeing a lot of news articles and recommendations that we should be wearing 2 masks. But that hasn't changed. So there wasn't any mention in the guidance about requiring students or staff members to wear 2 masks. The guidance is still talking about correct and adequate masks as being multi-layer, tightly woven masks. So that hasn't changed much. In terms of physical distancing, the guidance remains that schools should be promoting 6 feet of distancing whenever possible. Although, as Adam will discuss later, the extent to which that 6 foot of distance should be strictly applied changes somewhat based on the level of community transmission. All as generally speaking, I mean, I think the good news is that all of these mitigation strategies, if you look through the examples that the guidance provides, are things that most schools have been doing for the entire school year. So, I don't think this is going to require any sort of major shift in how you're operating in order to be in compliance with this guidance. One tip that they recommended, which I'm not sure if a lot of schools have been doing consistently, is that they recommended that school leaders periodically do sort of a classroom check, just to make sure that the individual teachers and individual classrooms have seating that has remained 6 feet of distance when possible. I know that in some classrooms, teachers are more concerned about the distancing rules than others, and so it's just a tip for ensuring more universal compliance with that rule. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Adam.
Thank you, Cathy, and hello to all of you who have come. The second thing that the guidance gets to after emphasizing the mitigation strategies is they're pretty concerned with monitoring community transmission. And really what that is a baseline. The idea is that, and it's pretty common sense, the more transmission there is in the community, the higher risk the schools are. And the lower transmission there is in the community, the lower risk the schools are. Now, that having been said, the gist of the guidance is, well, it doesn't matter how high or how low the community transmission is for purposes of whether or not you can have school open. You can always have school open even in what they call high transmission areas. It's just the guidance or the recommendations change based on that. So when we talk about community transmission, what are we talking about? The two sort of standards that CDC wants schools to look at are there are 2 measures. Number one, the total number of new cases per 100,000 persons in the past 7 days. And then number 2, the percentage of the nucleic acid amplification tests that result in positive tests in the last 7 days. I'm just going to call those NATs from now on, NAATs. Actually, I'll just call them NAATs. So the idea is that you work with the local health department to gather that information to gauge how high or how low community transmission is. Now, what CDC did that was different from what we've seen thus far, and by that I mean, certainly we've all seen the mitigation strategies in our own guidance. Heck, we've seen them since March. The mitigation strategy of wearing a face mask correctly is something we've dealt with. Nothing changed there. It's not as if all of a sudden face shields are a good replacement for a face mask. Obviously, you can have a face mask as a reasonable accommodation for somebody that can't wear a mask, but that guidance hasn't changed. It hasn't changed for masks. It hasn't changed for the most part for physical distancing. The idea, of course, that 6 feet is sort of your standard, and it can change. It can change based on your community transmission and the risks that are presented. Obviously, that can have an effect, but generally we know what we're doing there. This is a little different. We've never seen a blue, yellow, orange, red community transmission chart, and I don't have it on the slide. But for example, if we're talking about the NAATs, then anything that is up to 5% is going to be a positive test is going to be in your blue area. Your yellow area is 5 to 8%. Your orange area is 8 to 10%, and then red, which is high, is anything over 10%. So what happens with all that is first and foremost, it's not as if you in the high red area you need to have your school shut down. Now the recommendation is for high schools and middle schools that you go remote when you're in the red area. But again, I don't have the language pulled up directly in front of me, but CDC in its guidance makes it very clear, almost verbatim. It says it doesn't matter what area you're in. You can't. It's an option. You can choose to have school. You can choose to have all your schools open in the red area. Nothing's binding. Now I will say that the guidance is a little, as Cathy mentioned, less friendly to extracurriculars than Michigan has been. I know there's probably a number of people on this presentation who are sort of cringing as they read the slide and see the limitations on extracurriculars. The idea that extracurriculars really from moderate and above are going to be non-contact sports. But again, that's not binding. And I understand that there are going to be communities up in arms if you try to remove contact sports again because your NAAT positivity rate went above 5%. So we'll need to watch. I guess that's my recommendation. We'll need to watch to see what the state, how MHSAA and how the government MDHHS reacts to CDC's guidance to see if there's any shift in the way that they want to do things, to see if they want to make to pull back on extracurriculars a little bit more. I don't anticipate that at this time, but I'm not a prophet. So anyway, something to watch out for and keep your eye on with respect to the community transmission in the chart. But I wouldn't go throwing out your entire plan based on these recommendations, because again, in the end, they are not binding. They are recommendations, except as they may indirectly be implicated by what the state has you doing. So the last thing that is in sort of the bold print is the idea of phased mitigation. The idea that CDC has is in-person school is essential. And if in-person school is essential, then it should be the last to close and the first to open, provided that the community transmission rates permit it in conjunction with your mitigation efforts. There's Also, the idea that elementary schools, because younger students are less at risk than your middle and high school students. They are a little easier to have move in pods or in cohorts, so you can limit and mitigate your risk that way. For those reasons and a few others, elementary schools are the ones that sort of get prioritized for in-person learning. Similarly, schools with at-risk populations should be prioritizing those populations because of the problems that inhere with learning deficits, with opportunity deficits, and other factors. Obviously, as we've been saying for quite some time now, students with health risks, or those who live with health risks, probably shouldn't be returned to school, to in-person learning, to the extent that's possible. We want to be concerned with safety. And as I mentioned, with the elementary schools in particular, we should be considering pods and cohorts if community transmission is high, just as another mitigation strategy to prevent outbreaks. There are a couple of additional strategies that CDC has besides your principal 5 and really your principal 2 mitigation strategies, and those are testing and vaccination. I think as far as vaccination, we're all pretty much on the same page. Michigan has been robust and in prioritizing school staff, and I don't think this guidance in particular is really geared toward Michigan. And really, in the end, the CDC is writing a 50-state strategy, and Michigan has been more on the leading edge than other states have been. So I understand, and in fact, I think that goes in general for this guidance. The CDC was writing for Alaska and Texas and Michigan and Florida, and in fact, either in the Department of Education's guidance or in the CDC's principal document, there was a statement that to the effect of, one mitigation strategy might be opening windows and running fans. And I'm reading that, in my freezing cold house in the middle of February in Michigan. And usually, notwithstanding the deep freeze that Texas has been in this week, usually you might be open the windows in Texas, but certainly not in Michigan. So again, I think this has been, we have more specific guidance from Michigan, and in the realm of vaccination, certainly we have been prioritizing our teachers and our school staff. The other additional strategy that is mentioned is testing, and certainly at a minimum, what we would like to be doing is offering referrals for those who have symptoms. There is a little bit of guidance for if schools are engaged in advanced screening. Frankly, I think it's a bit of a headache. I am not the one who makes the decisions for the schools, obviously, but I think between if you're having obviously, aside from your questions about HIPAA, if you're testing on site, you have to have certifications and you have to report to certain agencies, and there are a number of strings attached. But if you're doing it, then CDC has said that you should prioritize staff, and then you prioritize basically from oldest on down to youngest, right? Staff, middle high school students, then elementary students. Okay, I did want to provide a very quick update on the FFCRA tax credit developments. My disclaimer is certainly that there was a document released on February 8th by the Ways and Means Committee. It was just a proposal. It's going to need House approval. It goes to the House, I think next week was the last I saw on it. And then after that, provided the House doesn't make huge changes, it'll go to the Senate. And provided the Senate doesn't make huge changes, then we have what we kind of have. But the big news from it is that if this is passed, the FFCRA tax credits will be extended from March 31st through September of this year, and they're going to be available to state and local governments. The bad news, of course, is that, the good news is that it goes to schools. The bad news is it's not retroactive. So I made a wager and lost for the past year. When coming up with the FFCRA forms, we've had a couple of provisions in there that apply really just for the taxes, tax credits, things like, if your child is 14 or older, they can't be, they're not taken care of. There's nobody to take care of them, things like that. So I lost the bet in that I was betting when I added these. I thought there would be retroactivity eventually, or I hope there would be. There is not. So the good news, though, is that if your school would like to voluntarily extend those tax credits through September, they certainly can. Now, there are a couple of other provisions, as I've read the summary of what came out of the Ways and Means Committee, that you're going to want to pay attention to if they end up going through. One of which is a reset to the paid sick leave days. If somebody takes EPSLA leave after March 31st, then they have a new set of 10 days that you can take the credits for. There was no reset between when the FFCRA first came in to now. If it was exhausted, it was exhausted. Obviously, there's no similar reset for EFMLEA because, well, that's part of your FMLA, your general FMLA pool. Couple of other things that I see that I'm running short on time, and I'm about to break our promise to go under half an hour here. You'll want to watch out for is possible expansions for reasons to take FFCRA leave. In particular, I'm thinking and I'm seeing the prospect of if somebody is going to get a vaccination, or if somebody is recovering from an injury or disability or illness related to an immunization, then they can take paid leave for that reason. I've also seen the notion that that employees will be able to take paid family leave, that is EFMLEA, or EFMLEA, sorry, for any of the reasons that EPSLA was available, not just the one. But again, we're going to have to see whether that makes it through the ways, through the House and the Senate after it's come out of the Ways and Means Committee. So that's sort of the long and short of it. I would just recommend that everybody stay tuned for that, which of course is the last slide. And I know I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I thank you all for coming today. If you have any questions, I will sit around here, or at least I will. I don't make any promises for Cathy, and I can answer some questions in the Q&A box. Obviously, my email is also up there on your screen. Feel free to shoot anything to me as far as clarifications if I confused you or if I wasn't clear about something during the presentation. But anyway, I will wrap up now. Thank you all for coming.